If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism. For non-Catholics, relics are one of the weirdest things, if not the weirdest thing, about Catholicism. The word relic comes from the Latin relique and refers to some object, notably part of the body or clothing, remaining as a memorial of a departed saint. They are kept and treasured in containers that are called reliquaries, some of which are made of glass so you can see the item inside. Every Catholic church has at least one relic inside the altar, and some churches and shrines have dozens, even hundreds. There are all sorts of examples. On my trips to Italy, I've taken people to a particular church in Rome, next to the Pantheon, that has St. Catherine of Siena's body in it. But then we go north to the city of Siena in Tuscany, where her thumb and her head are on display. It's a long story as to why she's divided between the two places. But I mean, there they are, a sort of shriveled thumb and a dried up head. You step up and look at them through glass in a church, and if you're Catholic and devoted to the memory of St. Catherine, you make the sign of the cross and say a prayer. And non-Catholics look at you like you've lost your mind. I could give 1,000 examples like that. But most relics, especially those that you'd see in the United States, are either tombs containing a saint's remains or tiny slivers of bone, like the size of your fingernail clippings, or maybe a lock of hair or a bit of clothing from a long-departed saint that are kept in a little glass reliquary in a chapel somewhere in the church. Now, the Protestant reformers like John Calvin and Martin Luther were not amused, and they ranted and raved about the evil of Catholic relics. And so Protestants, raised in Calvinist or Lutheran denominations, look at them with horror, like objects of the occult. Evangelicals and secularists tend just to be puzzled and turned off, thinking that Catholics are crazy and missing the whole point of Christianity, which they sort of narrowly define as having only to do with faith or social action. So, in one of our church chats with Ed, my Protestant friend Ed finally got around to asking me about this weird Catholic fascination with relics of the saints. Welcome to Church Chats with Greg and Ed, where Greg and his Protestant friend Ed chat about the church.
Okay, so last, was it fall? I took a tour of the cathedral in Grand Rapids, which was fascinating. And one of the things I learned from you led the tour, and one of the things I learned was that the altar, you were showing us the parts of the church, and the altar, you said, was required to have a relic in it. And, excuse me, that was the first time I ever thought about relics being important. And I thought, really, this is a whole different thing than I thought it was. And
right.
And every altar in the world has got a relic. Well, what's a relic, and how do we get so many of them, and what's the importance of them,
Right.
And that's so we often start these out with me saying this, so I'm just going to say it again.
Yeah.
From the outside looking in,
right.
Okay, it has always seemed superstitious to me. Like, don't these things lead people to practically worship the artifacts?
Right.
And I know that's kind of a cheap argument because, well, people do all kinds of bad things, and it's not. They misunderstand it, or they intentionally mess it up, or whatever. But it does seem to me like an invitation to superstition. And I found a quote from John Calvin, because I knew we were going to talk about this.
My former,
I'll just burn through it real quick here. I'm coming in the middle of the quote. The first abuse, and as it were, the beginning of the evil, was that when Christ ought to have been sought in his word, sacraments, and spiritual influences, the world, after its wont, I love that. No one uses that word anymore. After its want.
W-O-N-T.
Yes,
it's a great word.
Yeah, clung to his garments, vests, and swaddling clothes, and thus, overlooking the principal matter, followed only its accessory. It is of no use to discuss the point whether it is right or wrong to have relics merely to keep them as precious objects without worshiping them, because experience proves that this is never the case. In other words, they always end up being worshipped. That's John Calvin's position. So let's start out there, if you would. What are these things, and why? And why are they important?
So, okay. I can't wait to get to Calvin on this one, but let's start with a definition of what a relic is. Well, let's do it this way. In the Catholic Church, there are 3 actual classifications of relics, 3 classes. There's first-class relics, second-class relics, and third-class relics. So let's start. That might give us a definition. A first-class relic is either the body or parts of the body of a saint.
Okay.
So somebody who's a declared saint, it's their body, their skeleton, their thigh bone, right? Their skull. Right. We'll get into all these, and there you can find all of those things.
A question arises quickly in my mind. If it takes a long time to end up for a person to end up being declared a saint, mm-hmm. do they keep these bodies on file so that in case they
Actually, as a matter of fact, yes. So let me get to the. Okay, well, all right. I'm gonna get a little detour.
I'm sorry,
here.
that was a little.
Okay. No, that's okay. It's a quick little detour, but don't let me forget to get to the second and third class relics. That's what I love about these conversations.
Right.
We go all over the place. They're rather peripatetic,
right.
Where we wander about.
Ooh.
But yeah, that's a fancy word. There's an etymology to that word. That was said about Aristotle, because when Aristotle walked about, he walked about while he taught.
As was his wont.
And so he was peripatetic. And so these are peripatetic conversations with Ed. Church chats with Ed wander. In any case, the bodies. So did you come with us to the Detroit field trip?
No,
you didn't.
No.
So when we went over, I took a couple of months ago, we took 60 people over to see some holy sites in Detroit. And one of them, the tomb and a center for Blessed Solanus Casey. He was a friar, a Franciscan friar who lived in a monastery or a Franciscan monastery or house in Detroit and served the poor. It's kind of a legend in the Detroit Catholic community during the Great Depression. Mm-hmm. Anyway, long story, but he is on the road to sainthood. There's like 3 or 4 gradations to sainthood. And anyway, when Solanus Casey passed away, they buried him there in the Franciscan house, mm-hmm. in a tomb. And then over the years, people visit his tomb and so on and so forth. And as he progresses more and more potentially to sainthood, let's suppose he achieves and is canonized by the church. Well, we know where he is. Right. And if you go back in church history, and probably the best example of this is the Apostle Peter. So when Peter was martyred, he was executed in a stadium in Rome. It wasn't the Colosseum, but it was across the river in what is now the Vatican. And he was crucified upside down, and then they chopped him down, and his body was given to the Christians, and they went across the street or just outside the stadium, and they buried him in essentially a public cemetery. And everybody in Rome who was a Christian go, oh, well, that's Peter. And they began to come to his tomb to pray and leave flowers and things of that nature, as we would do even today with the grave of a person that was beloved. Over time, when Rome became Christian, they built a church over the top of his tomb, and that was St. Peter's Basilica. Mm-hmm. And in any case, when eventually about 100 years ago, or nearly 100 years ago, when that was excavated beneath St. Peter's Basilica, the current St. Peter's Basilica, you went down there in these kind of catacomb area, and there's this tomb, and the Romans were really into graffiti, and there's graffiti on it that Roman graffiti that says Peter is here. Somebody goes out to the graveyard where all the little headstones and mausoleums are, and somebody scratches Peter's tomb.
Right.
And that was how Christians went to it. Well, that's there. And it's one of the rarest things that you can do in the entire city of Rome is to get the privilege of going down 70 feet below the altar in St. Peter's Basilica and seeing the tomb of Peter and seeing the graffiti on it. And I have gotten to do that twice in my life, two of the greatest moments of my life. But the point is that when you look at where these first-class relics came from, often they were people who were martyrs or prominent or treasured in their life. And when they passed away, everyone knew where their tomb was and they were buried there. And then over time, as they were canonized, their relics, their bodies or parts of their bodies were valued. And in many cases, they were, and this is the part that we'll get into, I'm sure, they were, how shall I say this, kind of cut up.
Right.
And you would send a portion of the body to one place and some of it to another so that people could have pieces of the body. So in any case, a first-class relic in the Catholic Church is the body or portion of the body of a saint. Mm-hmm. Second-class relic is clothing or personal items that belonged to a saint or that a saint touched or interacted with. So, for example, if we go to Italy and we go to Assisi, and as we sit out here at the One Whirling Adventure compound,
the secret compound, by the way.
Secret outdoor compound, we have a statue of St. Francis of Assisi adjacent to us here. But when we go to Assisi, we not only is St. Francis buried in the basilica there, but in a room not far adjacent from where his tomb is, there is a room that has a lot of his objects. So his tunic and his belt and his shoes are preserved. Mm-hmm. And those would be second-class relics. Probably the most famous second-class relic, if it's authentic, is the Shroud of Turin, which is with the burial cloth of Jesus, purportedly.
Right.
But that would be an example of a second-class relic, okay? A third-class relic is something that an object that was touched to a first class as a second class relic. Okay. Now this gets a little bit, right? They're like the bottom class, right? Right. But you might say, for example, there are cases of this where someone says, hey, I've got a rosary or I've got some object and I'm going to visit the tomb of so-and-so and be able to kind of touch the rosary or touch some object, a crucifix or something to the body of the saint or to their bones. Right. And then there's, in a sense, right, it's special. Right. And of course, Protestant friends out there are going, this is so weird and so magical. But, look, you all go get autographs or see your favorite, sports star or music star or whatever and want to get a selfie or an autograph. Right. And there's giant trade in footballs or basketballs or jerseys signed by Tom Brady. And so, those go for big dollars. You got a jersey signed by Tom Brady, then it's huge.
I have a CD cover signed by Brian Wilson.
Well, there you go.
I built a shrine in the bottom of a drawer someplace, and that's where it is.
Best thing I've got is I've got a golf hat that Phil Mickelson signed.
Oh,
when I met Phil
go.
Mickelson once, after a golf tournament that I went to and watched him. And so, I've got my Phil Mickelson hat in my office, And so, people treasure things that have been touched by someone. Mm-hmm. And for someone to say, hey, that's just superstition, right? Obviously, we treasure objects that have been touched by someone that we value. But that's what a third-class relic is. It would be an object that was touched to a first-class relic. Make sense?
Yep.
So those are three classes of relics. If you were to sum those up, they are objects that either that are the bodies of saints or are closely associated with the bodies of saints, in the case of second and third-class relics, that have been preserved and they're not worship and they're not magical items, but they're treasured, they're valued. And then there's this word in Catholicism, venerated. Mm-hmm. And Protestants will always say, well, you're worshiping. That's not what veneration means. It means respected, deeply valued. When I venerate something, I show honor and respect to it. So when I go to, looking at the statue of St. Francis here next to our table, when I go to Assisi, and I go to the tomb of St. Francis of Assisi and I kind of kneel down and say a prayer and I show great respect and honor to St. Francis's relics. I'm showing honor to the Lord through St. Francis. and in gratitude for the things that St. Francis has done for us.
Right.
And we did another episode where we talked about praying to saints, so I don't really going to cover that.
Right.
But that's what relics are. They're physical objects associated with the bodies of saints in some way.
Would this example be accurate in my own life? When my mom passed away and my dad moved out of the place they lived, the condo they lived in, my mom had this hutch with all of her keepsake dishes and little knickknacks and things, and I have them all, most of them. Some of them have gone to my daughters, but a lot of them are just sitting in a box. But I sometimes go through the box and I sit and hold the thing in my hand. And I have a list of what they are. My mom was smart enough to put numbers on the bottom of them on stickers. And then she made a list and said, this is where I got this and this is why I liked it.
Right.
And I think, so my baby book. Okay.
Right.
All right. So, and I read the names of the people who visited her in the hospital and all that. And some of them I know and some of them I never knew. But I hold it in my hand and I think my mom held this in her hand. And my mom was an important person in my life, and I respect and honor my mom. And I would say to somebody, if I handed you the baby book and you dropped it, or I'd be like, be careful with that. And that's got meaning. That has meaning for me. And and it's not my mom. I know that. It's a way for me to hold something in my hands that helps me to honor my mother.
Okay, that's a great example. And let me agree with part of it and disagree with part of it. So talking about your mom passing and her objects. So my mom passed away 2 months ago.
Right.
In fact, today, the day we're recording this, is exactly 60 days. I thought about that this morning. So it's been exactly 60 days since my mom passed. I was sitting there praying the rosary next to her in the hospice when she stopped breathing. And we're just as a family still kind of going through the process of going through her things.
Sure.
It takes time to kind of, you just don't, obviously in a week decide, hey, we're just going to toss out a bunch of mom's stuff. Like we've been going through her things and deciding what to keep. And, it's a very, emotional process. And there are certain things we're deciding to keep because mom valued them and she touched them and she used them. And I know it's kind of crazy. Maybe this is a 21st century sort of thing. But one of the things that I have sitting in my office right now is my mom's cell phone, my mom's iPhone.
Yeah.
And she used to text me on it, because we live in different states, and she would text me and send me little pictures every day. And I was just sitting on my desk, and my mom, touched this every day and sent me texts. So there's something that touched somebody you loved and reminds you of them. It calls them to mind. You feel a sense of connection and intimacy.
It anchors you to that person a little bit.
It does. And it is anchor is a good word. I think also like a bridge, right? Like this phone is the thing. I'm holding it now and my mom held it and we've both held this phone.
Right.
And there's it's a bridge to that person, and it centers your love and value and memory of that person. Okay. So on the one hand, I agree that the relics are that, but disagree because it actually goes one step further. In the case, especially of the first class relics, it's not something that my mom touched or used. It's actually my mom. So it's more akin to going to the cemetery. Or if your loved one was cremated, and you have the remains in an urn on your shelf or whatnot, and you look at those remains. And I know that people out here who are listening to this who aren't Catholic can relate to that. If you have a loved one's remains in an urn on a shelf in your room, and you look at them, you go, that was grandpa, or that was my mom, or whatever. And it's not like that reminds me of them. That's actually them. That's their remains. And you put an enormous amount of value on it. You couldn't imagine somebody doing something to your mom's, the urn with your mom's remains in it. Right. I mean, that's inconceivable that somebody would lose it or destroy it or spill it, or if your loved one was buried in a cemetery and somebody dug up their body or desecrated their grave. I mean, it's not just their memory. They're actually desecrating their remains.
Yeah.
That's them, and it's their body. It's a piece of them. So the first class relics are actually not only bridges to the person, they're what's left of that person.
Right.
And this is where I think that relics, the big idea from within Catholicism about this is that Catholicism is focused on the incarnation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we'll get around to this Calvin quote here in a second that you shared. But Catholicism is incarnational. And what I mean by that, we've talked about this before, is that it's a sacramental religion or an incarnational religion. In other words, Catholicism treasures the material world because God created the material. It was good. In the days of creation, the 6 days of creation, God creates everything and says, and it was good, and it was good, and it was very good. The creation was good. God likes matter. He created it. There's not a distance. Matter, the material world is not somehow inferior or diminished from, that's a heresy. That's the ancient heresy of Gnosticism and Marcionism and all these different isms that said that the real thing that was valuable, the real world, what God really cares about is the spiritual world, and then the material world is this diminished thing. And it's an ancient heresy that says what we really want to do is escape this material world to go up and float on a cloud, and pluck a harp or something in the spiritual realm. God created the material world good, and he put us in it. And I think one of the things to remember is that humans are a fusion by God's design of the material and spiritual. So let me put it this way. When you read Genesis 2, second chapter of Genesis, and you read how God created mankind, here's what it does not say. It does not say God created Adam and then gave him a body.
Mm-hmm.
What it says is that God took the dust of the earth from the ground and formed it and breathed life into it. So we are not spirits that have been given bodies. We are the dust of the earth that has had the spirit of life breathed into us. We are essentially, and that's a technical word, we were talking about Thomas Aquinas before we started the recording. Thomas Aquinas talks about what something's essence is. And our essence consists of a spiritual and material component. The reason I'm saying all this is that when someone dies, it isn't like, well, that's just their body that doesn't matter. That's part of them.
Right.
And the entire hope of the resurrection. So it's an incarnation religion because God himself incarnated himself and took on human form and a human body. And when he died, that body was resurrected. And our whole hope and promise, Paul says in Corinthians, our entire hope is in the resurrection, that we too will be resurrected. So bodies matter.
Right.
The body matters. And that body, whether it's your mom's body or the body of St. Peter or the body of St. whoever, is going to be resurrected, is going to be resurrected in the new world. And that's them, or the part of them that's still here.
Right.
So it isn't this macabre, weird thing to treasure and value what we still have of that person.
Right.
In the hope and expectation that in the resurrection, when Christ returns, that body will be reconstituted in the resurrected form. And so we hold on to the part of them that's still here. And we treasure that part of them that is still with us. And that's the incarnational religion. Now let's go back to that Calvin quote. Read it again.
Okay. The first abuse, and as it were, beginning of the evil, was that when Christ ought to have been sought in his word, sacraments, and spiritual influences, the world, after its wont, clung to his garments, vests, and swaddling clothes.
Stop. Okay. First of all, again, when I said Calvin's my dude, so as I've shared in other episodes, I went to a Calvinist seminary.
Right.
It was actually called Calvin Seminary. And so I was trained in Calvinism. And look, right away, this is Calvin being Calvin. The first evil was that men didn't, tell us how you really feel, John.
Right.
But the thing is that the first evil was that men didn't seek him as Calvin would prefer in his word. So, in other words, in intellectual pursuit and explanation and preaching and reading and preaching and all this kind of verbal intellectual thing, but that they clung to the things that he left behind. Okay, so first of all, that's an argument that that's evil on Calvin's part. He can argue that it was evil that people treasured what was the remnants of Jesus, but it's not clear that that's biblically evil. Where does, for all of John Calvin's insistence that it's sola scriptura and only what's in the Bible, where does it say in the Bible that if people, if the first community of Christians kept the shroud he was buried in, or the swaddling clothes that Mary maybe treasured after he died, that was evil? Does Calvin have a place where it says that if Mary and the first community of Christians had his swaddling clothes, that was a bad thing? Because I don't know where that verse is. That's just Calvin making an insistence that he would prefer people read the Bible rather than treasure things. Secondly, it doesn't seem to follow, because what happens? Jesus dies, and what was typical in a Roman crucifixion is that the body would be taken out, thrown into a mass grave, okay, by the centurions. The Christians asked for Christ's body. It was given to them. And then he was buried in a rich man's tomb, right? Joseph of Arimathea gave his own tomb, very wealthy, and elaborate, spices and all these things were prepared, for him. And they valued his body. And afterwards, they wanted to go out and visit his body. And then there's the thing that after Peter goes into the empty tomb and he sees the shroud lying there. Now, we don't have, it doesn't say in the Bible that they kept the shroud, but one would assume, it's only common sense that Peter didn't say, well, who cares about the shroud that Jesus was wrapped in? He probably picked it up. We don't have any biblical evidence, and there's no proof, and I'm not arguing the Shroud of Turin is that, although it could be. But my point is that there's nothing in there that says that if Peter and the first Christians kept the shroud, that there was anything wrong with that, or there was anything wrong with valuing those things. And what we do know for a fact is that if John Calvin thought that was evil, we know that within a generation, that when the first apostles started dying and were being buried in the catacombs in these places, that the first generation of Christians, the second generation of Christians, were going to the catacombs and treasuring the tombs.
So Calvin is arguing. So Calvin is saying, in a sense, that the early Christians just had it all messed up. They were doing it all wrong.
Yeah, and this was part of my journey from Calvinism to Catholicism, was the realization, you and I have talked about this in previous episodes, the realization when I began to actually look at the history of the church and then look at early church history, a lot of things that, whether it was Calvin or Luther, that insisted on 1,500 years later, just weren't borne out by how the first generation or two of Christians lived. And when you go back to Calvin's quote about that, who never says what Calvin says in that quote? Any of the church fathers. So you go back to the first, second, third century, none of the church fathers say, hey, those of you who are going to the tombs of the apostles and praying and valuing their tombs or their bodies or whatever, that's an evil. You should just stay home and read the Bible. They never say that. Calvin says that, but nobody ever said that before Calvin and Luther. So, the truth is that from the earliest time, the bodies, the remains of apostles and saints were treasured. Now, we haven't gotten yet, and we will, to chopping them up into pieces and putting them in little reliquaries and carrying them to churches and sticking them in altars. We'll get to that. But I just want to establish the principle that treasuring the remains of apostles and saints is natural and wonderful and really not unusual for how we treasure the values, the remains of those we love.
So this leads me to, as usual, you've answered a lot of my objections already, so I'm not going to burn through them. But two questions remain for me. Why does the church altar have a relic? I think that's an easy answer, but I want to hear what you say. And the other thing is, what is the value then? Could you sum up what's the value of the relics for, your first, second, and third class relics? What value do relics have for a Catholic, for a practicing Catholic?
Okay, so let's take the altar thing first. So in the altar, and we'll probably have to do a whole nother episode on this, but what takes place during the Mass, the sacrifice of the Mass. We're going to be doing a whole lot of episodes on this podcast. I'm going to be doing a whole series on the Eucharist. I've started it. Depending on when this episode we're recording right now airs, that series may have already started. But in the Eucharist, the sacrifice of Christ is celebrated on the altar. Right? And an altar is, and what is an altar? Well, he is the perfect Paschal lamb, right? He is the sacrificial lamb, the Passover lamb that is sacrificed for the sins of the people. That's what he calls himself. That's what they were called. Right. Behold, the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world, right? He is the Lord himself provided the sacrifice. This is Abraham and Isaac. This is, Jesus on Good Friday. And we celebrate that on the altar where that lamb is sacrificed, not re-sacrificed. So listen to the episodes about that because he isn't re-sacrificed. That's a sort of Renaissance or a Reformation and sort of Protestant misunderstanding. But that we participate in that sacrifice. And so the reason why all Catholic altars, in order to be consecrated as an altar, there's actually like a cavity. When an altar is made, you can't just do the Mass on any table, except in extraordinary circumstances, say, for example, like a military chaplain or whatever. But that's even a special case where they sometimes have like a little altar stone that they set down, maybe like, if they're doing it on the hood of a Jeep or something in a war zone. But in general, a consecrated altar has a cavity in it, and in it are put 2 first-class relics. They have to be first-class relics. So they are slivers of bones. Like at our parish, we have a like a plaque in the wall of the sacristy, like a little certificate, and it's the slivers. And when I say sliver, I mean like when you clip your fingernails and there's a tiny little sliver of fingernail that you clip off. It's like that big. It's just like a little sliver of bone of these 2 kind of medieval saints. And there's a whole thing in the Vatican where those are distributed, right? So they go, hey, this is Saint so-and-so from the year 900, and when somebody in the world is going to create a new church or a new altar, these little slivers of bone or whatever are distributed. And the reason they're in there is that 2 things, I think. One is that there is a holiness of the church and the saints that participate in that. But there's also kind of a reference in the book of Revelation when John sees the throne room and he sees the sacrifice of the lamb, and it says beneath the altar are the sacrifice, the martyrs and the saints, or beneath that altar. It's sort of a callback to that the what we're doing in the Mass and in the Eucharist is we're participating in what's going on in the eternal, before the eternal throne of God, and the martyrs and the saints are a part of the altar of the sacrifice upon which Christ is there. So that's that. And when you build a new Catholic church, you have to get permission and all that, and the bishop has to consecrate the altar. And there's a verification, and these 2 little things are put in like a lead capsule, sort of, and then it's inserted in a little cavity in the altar and sealed. And that's why if you desecrate an altar, you can't just like throw it away. Right. So if you tear down an old church or whatever, you can't just throw the altar away. It has to be unconsecrated and the relics removed. Right. So that's about altars. But you asked about
what are the so what's the value? Sum up. We've talked a long time about this now, but what's the value of relics in a Catholic's life?
So, first of all, let's think about that word Catholic, right? The word means universal. And when you listen to this podcast, you hear me say in the intro to it that, it's a church of spanning 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, with people from every race, tribe, language, and nation. Right. And the first value, I think, of the relics is that sense of community and connection. It preserves that sense of community. Every time that I have visited the tomb of a saint or the relics of a saint or whatever, I feel this powerful sense of connection. And again, you've been to Cleveland to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and you go there and you see all of the memorabilia, Elvis's guitar, or, whatever. They have, Elvis's sequin. Is it like Fat Elvis or Early Skinny Elvis or whatever, his sequin jumpsuit or whatever it is, and we preserve those objects because they connect us to people. Or if you go to Canton, Ohio, to the NFL Hall of Fame, and you see all of these things, there's a sense of connectedness. And within the church, it's a sense of connectedness to all of those over the 20 centuries and 24 time zones and 2 hemispheres from every race, tribe, language, and nation that have all been there. And I've always felt, whenever I visited the tombs of saints or whatever, this intense sense of connection. I can't tell you how powerful it was on the 2 occasions I've gotten to do it, to go down, 70 feet into the essentially catacombs, not technically catacombs, but down into the area below the altar, and to see the tomb of Peter. And what a sense of connection. Like, this is Peter. This is Peter the fisherman. And all of a sudden I feel connected to all of the generations of Christians that have spread throughout the world over the ages. That sense of connectedness is, I think, part of the value of relics. I think the second value is their ability as what's called a sacramental, not a sacrament to focus our devotion. So when I go to Assisi and I kneel before the tomb of St. Francis, I'm not worshiping St. Francis. I'm worshiping God, but I'm paying respect just in the same way that you pay respect at your mother's grave. I'm paying respect to what is left of St. Francis, and treasuring and valuing him, and focusing all of my love and devotion and respect that I feel for God and the gift and the thing of the St. Francis and the things that he taught and accomplished. It's a focal point for that. And that's what a sacramental is, point of focus for that devotion. And then the third thing is, and this is the part that I suppose gets controversial, is the sense of, do the relics have power, any sort of power to accomplish miracles? Now, this is where it gets weird, because Protestants will say, well, Catholics believe in magic and they become magic objects. But let's think of what magic is. It's actually the opposite of magic. Magic, and by magic, I mean, evil, occultish, magic, is the notion that I can compel the gods or the spiritual world by the use of certain physical objects. So what is it? Eye of... the
Eye of Newt or something.
Eye of Newt, and whatever, lips of toads or whatever. And if I put the lips of the toads and the eyes of the newts and whatever, and mix them with these berries and under the moonlight in a certain way, in a certain kind of cup, that I can sort of force somebody to love me or force the gods to do something. That is using the physical world to sort of compel the heavenly world, right?
Yep.
The notion of the Catholic miracles is quite actually the opposite. It's the notion that God uses physical things in our world. So we've talked about this before. Aaron's staff, the burning bush. Jesus, when he wants to heal the blind man, takes some dirt and spits in it and makes a kind of a paste in a mud and rubs it in his eyes. There's always the sense that sometimes God uses objects. And so it's not me compelling God, it's God working in response to my prayers, my devotion. Lord, heal me, Lord, whatever it is that you're praying for. The notion that God in some way sometimes uses objects as a focus point. And so it's not me compelling God in a magical way, but God actually reaching out to me through these points of connection.
This started when we did the podcast about Mary, which I think was the one we recorded before this. I started getting a much deeper sense of this. I had it sort of building already, but that everything is part of the story. This isn't the physical world isn't an illusion. It's part of it's part of it. Yeah. We had a cat that we had put down, my wife and I.
Otis?
And no, not Otis.
Otis.
There was another one. His name was Presto.
Oh, I didn't meet Presto. I knew
you meet
Otis.
Presto. It was spelled Presto, but it was pronounced Presto because he was annoying. Yeah, he was annoying. He chattered and whined and when we had him put down, I walking into the veterinarian's office, I thought, oh, I'm so glad this is over.
Right.
I hate this cat. And then I cried like a little girl.
Oh, yeah.
And we were my wife was talking about it with her friend, and her friend said, well, my wife says, well, why, I don't understand why I cried so hard when I was really so sad, sorry, happy to see the cat go. And she said, he's part of the story.
Right.
He was part of the story. He was the cat you owned when you met and married Ed and so forth and so on. And that's how I feel. I'm starting to feel about, so I can see standing at the tomb of Peter. Mm-hmm. You think this was a dude who was just a kid fishing, just a guy. He didn't know this was coming. He was just a guy, and he fished and he worked with his hands just like a lot of people do, just like I have done. And he lived and he breathed and he ate and he slept and he died and he fell in love with somebody, or maybe he didn't, and he had arguments with people and he wished for things and then it was done, and all these things happened to him, and I'm the same thing. Yeah. I'm made of the same stuff. It's the material world. It's all part of what's going on, and God is using all of it. All of it's part of the story.
100 miles from where we sit right now as the crow flies is Chicago. Mm-hmm. And in Chicago is the tomb of St. Frances Cabrini, known as Mother Cabrini. She is the first U.S. citizen ever canonized as a Catholic saint. She was an Italian immigrant, came over during the great wave of immigration, and she... I did a whole One Whirling Adventure video episode about her. We'll link that. But, oh my goodness, I mean, she started something like 200 or 300 schools, hospitals, orphanages, amazing works of mercy and ministry among the poor immigrants of America at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And when she passed away, all of America wept. And they did a ceremony for her when she was beatified and canonized. They filled Soldier Field, filled Soldier Field Stadium with people. And anyway, her tomb is there. And one of the things, going back to your thing about Presto the cat and the story, when you go down to Chicago here and you go and visit her tomb, you think about all that God did. And in a sense, it's about God's story. It's all about all the amazing works of the kingdom of God and how it's all unfolded through the ages and how it unfolded in American history and how the tens of thousands of children that were cared for in those orphanages and the people in the hospitals and all the ways that God, through Mother Cabrini, impacted, generations of people and impacted and shaped this nation. And when you sit before her tomb and her remains and what is left of her, it connects you to that story and to her. And then for you to say, God, help me to be as brave as she was. Help me to be as compassionate as she was. Help me to use the time and the treasures and the talents that you've given me to try to serve others the way she did, and to say to her, Mother Cabrini, pray for me that I can try to follow your example. And then if you reach out and put your hand on the tomb and hope that somehow, that God, not that there's magic in that, but that in that point of connection that maybe the Holy Spirit will, breathe a little bit of that life into you. Right. What a beautiful thing. And I think it's so impoverished. This is what I felt in my evangelical world life, my Protestant life, is it's such an impoverished vision of life in the kingdom. We have the Bible and we have praise songs, but it isn't that we don't have people to build orphanages and do missions, but why not have the fullness of the incarnational value of people and the saints and their bodies and what remains of them.
And what other value is there that we don't know of yet? What's that Shakespeare quote? There are greater things in your in
heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your
philosophy. Yes, yeah,
that's from Hamlet.
I love that. We have a friend who's a naturopath, and she was doing this thing where she was looking at my eye, and I think your liver is whatever. and I thought, wouldn't it be just like God to put that together like that? Yeah. I'm not saying she's right or wrong. I don't know about that stuff, but that's what I think that's what I'm picking up from all of this is a sense of how it's all connected.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Ed.
All right. Yeah. That's great.
Okay. Bye. Thank you for listening. My name is Greg Smith. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, would you please hit the like and subscribe buttons wherever you get your podcasts? And please share it with others. And if you're curious about the Catholic worldview and faith, the Church and its saints, or Catholic history, culture, and art, then visit consideringcatholicism.com. And email me to let me know what you think. Greg@consideringcatholicism.com.